Forced to work for the billionaire Alpha CEO, he rejected. Omega falls for his own boss. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Sometimes the person you run from is the only person who never stopped waiting. The elevator climbed toward the executive floor with a quiet mechanical hum, yet every passing second felt louder than the last inside Julian Mercer's chest. 3 years of carefully rebuilding his life had led him to this moment, and not once had he imagined fate would choose today to test every promise he had made to himself. He had accepted the position because he had no other choice. His mother's medical bills had drained every dollar he had saved. Freelance design work had become impossible to rely on, and the prestigious offer from Ashford Global had looked like the answer to every desperate prayer. The salary would keep his family afloat. The benefits would cover treatment. The opportunity could change his career forever. What the recruiter had never mentioned was the name of the company's elusive founder. The conference room doors opened with effortless elegance, revealing a space wrapped in glass, polished walnut, and the breathtaking skyline of Manhattan stretching for miles beyond. Executives in tailored suits stood as the CEO entered, conversations dissolving into respectful silence. Julian followed everyone's gaze, expecting to see another distant billionaire with an unreadable expression. Instead, the world seemed to stop turning. Damien Ashford, taller than Julian remembered, dressed in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit. Damien carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire from relentless discipline. His dark hair was neatly styled, his sharp jawline framed a calm expression that betrayed nothing, and his steel blue eyes swept across the room with effortless authority before stopping on Julian for only the briefest fraction of a second. No surprise crossed Damien's face. No anger. No warmth. Only perfect composure. "Welcome to Ashford Global," Damien said in a deep, measured voice. "I expect excellence from everyone in this room." His gaze moved on as though Julian were a complete stranger. The meeting continued, but Julian barely heard a word. 3 years earlier, Damien had not been a billionaire known across financial magazines. He had been an ambitious entrepreneur chasing impossible dreams, and Julian had been the one person who believed in him until the day he quietly walked away. Damien had asked him to stay. Julian had said no. It was the single decision that haunted every sleepless night afterward, even though leaving had never been about falling out of love. Some truths were too painful to explain back then, and others had never found the right moment to be spoken aloud. "Mr. Mercer." Julian blinked, realizing Damien was addressing him directly. Every executive turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Damien's expression remained unreadable. "Beginning today, you will work directly with my office on the Horizon project." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. New employees almost never reported to the CEO. Julian forced himself to answer calmly. "Thank you for the opportunity." Damien gave a single polite nod before closing his tablet. Meeting adjourned. Chairs shifted, conversations resumed, and executives slowly filed out, whispering about the unexpected assignment. Julian gathered his notebook with trembling fingers, hoping to disappear before Damien noticed him again. "Mr. Mercer." The voice stopped him at the doorway. He turned slowly. Everyone else had already left. Damien stood beside the panoramic window overlooking the city, sunlight outlining his silhouette against the skyline. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Damien looked at him with the same composed expression he had worn throughout the meeting. "Be in my office tomorrow at 7:30 sharp," he said evenly. "We have a great deal of work ahead of us." Julian searched Damien's face for resentment, disappointment, or even recognition of the past they had shared, but found only calm professionalism. "I'll be there," Julian answered softly. Damien offered one final nod before turning back toward the city below, silently dismissing him. As Julian stepped into the hallway, relief and dread tangled together inside his heart. He had come to Ashford Global hoping to save his family's future. He never expected to spend every day working beside the one man he had never truly stopped loving. or to discover that the greatest challenge waiting inside the tallest building in Manhattan had nothing to do with business at all. Julian barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Damien standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows with the same calm expression that had unsettled him far more than anger ever could have. If Damien had confronted him, demanded answers, or even admitted disappointment, Julian might have found the courage to explain what had happened 3 years earlier. Instead, Damien had treated him with flawless professionalism, and somehow that distance hurt even more. By 7:15 the next morning, Julian stood outside the executive office carrying a leather portfolio and a cup of plain black coffee he had picked up from the cafe downstairs. He had remembered that Damien always preferred black coffee, but after a moment of hesitation, he quietly threw it into a nearby trash bin. Bringing it upstairs would only reveal memories that Damien had every reason to leave behind. Exactly at 7:30, the office doors opened. Damien stepped out wearing another perfectly tailored suit, already reviewing financial reports on his tablet. He acknowledged Julian with a brief nod. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." The formal greeting felt like another invisible wall between them. "Good morning, sir," Julian replied. Damien handed him a digital schedule. "You will attend every executive meeting with me, organize presentation materials, coordinate with department heads, and prepare creative proposals for the Horizon project. I expect punctuality, honesty, and attention to detail. If something cannot be completed on time, tell me immediately rather than making excuses." Afterward, Julian looked over the packed schedule. Meetings stretched from early morning until nearly 8 in the evening. "Understood." Damien studied him for only a second before continuing down the hallway. "Then let us begin." The entire executive floor seemed to notice Julian following directly behind the chief executive officer. Curious eyes lingered from every office. Conversations stopped whenever they passed. By lunchtime, whispers had already spread throughout the building. Some employees insisted Julian must be a rising industry talent. Others believed he was secretly related to an important investor. A few quietly suggested the new designer had somehow earned the personal trust of the famously reserved Damien Ashford overnight. No one knew the truth. No one knew the silence between them carried the weight of 3 unfinished years. Throughout the day, Damien remained courteous but distant. Every instruction was clear, every decision logical, every conversation focused entirely on business. Yet Julian noticed small details that the public never saw. Damien skipped lunch without mentioning it. He personally thanked the maintenance worker who repaired a conference room projector. Before leaving one meeting, he paused long enough to compliment a young intern for presenting an original marketing idea, encouraging her to keep developing it. These quiet moments did not match the ruthless image financial magazines loved to publish. Late that afternoon, Julian accidentally left a folder in another conference room while rushing to prepare materials for the next presentation. Realizing his mistake, he hurried back, only to find Damien already holding the folder. Julian expected criticism. Instead, Damien simply handed it over. "Everyone makes mistakes during the first week," he said evenly. "Just do not make the same mistake twice." Julian accepted the folder with genuine surprise. "Thank you. It will not happen again." Damien gave one short nod and walked away before Julian could say anything else. Watching him disappear down the corridor, Julian felt something unexpected replacing his fear. Damien had every opportunity to embarrass him in front of the executive team. Instead, he had protected his dignity without drawing attention to it. The realization left Julian more confused than ever. If this was revenge, it was unlike anything he had imagined. And somewhere deep inside, a dangerous hope that he had buried years ago quietly began to breathe again. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt anything but ordinary to Julian. Every morning began with a detailed schedule prepared by Damien before sunrise. Every afternoon disappeared beneath presentations, client meetings, and endless revisions for the Horizon project. Every evening ended with the executive floor growing quiet while Damien remained in his office long after most of Manhattan had begun switching on its evening lights. Julian gradually realized that the billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers was also the last person to leave the building almost every night. The employees admired Damien, but they also feared him. Whenever he entered a conference room, Conversations became more focused, deadlines suddenly mattered, and careless mistakes disappeared. Yet Julian noticed something the others seemed to overlook. Damien never raised his voice. He never embarrassed anyone in public. If a proposal needed improvement, he explained exactly why. If someone deserved recognition, he made certain the entire team heard it. The intimidating reputation surrounding him came not from cruelty, but from impossibly high standards that he never failed to apply to himself first. Still, the rumors surrounding Julian only grew stronger. One afternoon, he entered the employee cafe to grab a bottle of water and noticed several conversations stopping the moment he walked in. Although nobody said anything directly, the lingering glances spoke louder than words. Why would the chief executive officer personally mentor a designer who had only been with the company for a few weeks? Some believed Julian had powerful connections. Others assumed Damien was preparing him for a major promotion. A few quietly suggested that Damien was intentionally giving him impossible workloads so he would eventually resign. Julian wished any of those explanations were true because the real reason remained locked inside his own heart. Late one evening, the creative department gathered around a conference table reviewing concepts for an important investor presentation. The team had spent hours debating ideas, yet nothing seemed good enough. Frustration filled the room. Finally, Julian hesitated before sliding one final design across the table. Silence followed. Damien studied the presentation without revealing any emotion. Nearly a full minute passed before he looked up. "This one," he said calmly. "It tells a story instead of selling a product. That is what our clients need to remember." The room relaxed instantly. Several department heads nodded in agreement. Julian felt a quiet sense of accomplishment until Damien added, "Excellent work, Mr. Mercer. Please prepare the final version for tomorrow morning." It was only a simple compliment, but hearing it from Damien carried unexpected weight. As the meeting ended, one of the senior executives approached Julian with an amused smile. "You know," he whispered, "I have worked with Damien Ashford for 8 years. He almost never praises anyone during a meeting. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." Julian forced a polite smile, but the words lingered with him long after everyone else had gone home. Later that night, he returned to the executive floor to retrieve a forgotten sketchbook. Passing Damien's office, he noticed the door slightly open. Damien sat alone beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp, jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as he quietly reviewed page after page of financial reports. A simple takeout container rested unopened beside his keyboard, now completely cold. For several moments, Julian stood there unseen, realizing Damien had once again skipped dinner while everyone else had already gone home. Without thinking, Julian walked to the break room, heated the meal in the microwave, and placed it outside Damien's office with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please eat before it gets cold." He slipped away before anyone could notice. Several minutes later, Damien opened the office door, looked down at the warm meal, then slowly picked up the note. He glanced toward the empty hallway, his usually unreadable expression softening for only a heartbeat before disappearing once again behind the calm mask he wore every single day. Autumn quietly settled over Manhattan, painting the trees along the avenues with shades of amber and gold, while Ashford Global entered its busiest quarter of the year. The Horizon project had become the company's highest priority, and every department depended on Damien's leadership to keep the ambitious launch on schedule. For Julian, that also meant spending nearly every hour of the workday only a few steps away from the man he had once believed he would never see again. The strange distance between them remained unchanged. Damien was always respectful, always patient, yet he never allowed a single conversation to drift toward anything personal. It was as though the past had been carefully locked inside a room whose key had been thrown away. Julian tried convincing himself that this was for the best, but every passing day made that lie more difficult to believe. One rainy evening, the executive team prepared for an important presentation to potential investors from California. A sudden software failure threatened to erase several hours of work only 30 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Panic spread across the conference room as managers searched for backup files. Julian immediately remembered saving an earlier version on a secure cloud drive and quietly restored every missing presentation within minutes. Relief swept across the room. Damien looked toward him with the same calm expression he always carried. Yet this time, there was unmistakable appreciation in his eyes. "Excellent thinking, Mr. Mercer," he said. "You prevented a serious delay." The meeting proceeded without incident, and the investors left impressed with both the presentation and the creative vision behind the Horizon project. As everyone celebrated another successful day, Damien remained behind in the conference room organizing scattered documents himself instead of asking an assistant to do it. Julian instinctively stayed to help. They worked in comfortable silence. Until Damien suddenly spoke. "You always notice the details other people overlook." Julian froze for a moment before quietly answering. "Someone once told me that small details become big memories." The words escaped before he realized where they had come from. Years earlier, Damien had said exactly the same thing while they were sharing coffee in a tiny neighborhood bookstore. Damien's hands paused over a stack of reports. For the briefest moment, the carefully built wall between them seemed to crack. "I remember saying that," he admitted softly. Julian looked up in surprise. Their eyes met across the polished conference table, and neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Then Damien gently cleared his throat, gathered the remaining files, and returned to the familiar distance that had defined every interaction since Julian joined the company. "You should head home," he said evenly. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Julian nodded, although disappointment quietly settled inside his heart. Walking toward the elevator, he wondered whether Damien had remembered far more than he allowed himself to show. The next morning, Julian arrived early and found a neatly wrapped package waiting on his desk with no note attached. Curious, he opened it and discovered a brand new sketchbook identical to the worn one he had been carrying for years. The expensive paper inside was perfect for concept illustrations. Julian looked around the office, but nobody claimed responsibility. When Damien walked past a few minutes later, Julian thanked him, hoping for confirmation. Damien simply glanced at the sketchbook before continuing toward his office. "Every designer deserves the right tools," he replied calmly. "Consider it an investment in the project." His answer sounded purely professional, yet Julian noticed the faintest hint of warmth hidden beneath the carefully chosen words. For the first time since joining Ashford Global, Julian realized the greatest mystery was no longer why Damien seemed so distant. The real mystery was why every thoughtful gesture Damien made felt as though it belonged to someone who had never truly stopped caring. Days gradually blended into weeks, and the Horizon project moved from planning into its most demanding stage. The executive team announced that Damien and Julian would travel together to Boston for a 3-day strategy summit with several major partners. It was the first business trip Julian had ever taken since joining Ashford Global, and despite telling himself it was only work, he could not ignore the quiet nervousness that followed him onto the early morning train. Damien spent most of the journey reviewing reports while the landscape slipped past the windows in shades of late autumn. Every so often he asked Julian's opinion about a presentation or a design concept, listening carefully before making a decision. Their conversations remained professional, yet they flowed with an ease that neither of them seemed able to explain. By the time they reached Boston, Julian realized they had spoken more during those few hours than they had during several weeks inside the office. The summit itself was exhausting. Meetings filled every hour from breakfast until evening receptions, and both of them worked long after returning to the hotel each night. One evening, the conference center lost power for several minutes because of a passing storm. Emergency lights illuminated the lobby with a warm golden glow while everyone waited for electricity to return. Standing beside a large window overlooking the rain, Julian quietly smiled. "This reminds me of the bookstore where we first met," he said before he could stop himself. Damien remained silent for several seconds. "You still remember that place?" he answered softly. "I remember everything," Julian admitted, his voice almost disappearing beneath the sound of the rain. Neither of them spoke again until the lights returned, but something invisible had changed between them. The following afternoon, the final presentation exceeded every expectation. Investors praised the creative direction, applauded the detailed market strategy, and agreed to move forward with a major partnership that would secure the future of the Horizon project. As the meeting ended, Damien unexpectedly addressed the room. The visual identity that convinced everyone today was created by Julian Mercer. Please make certain the recognition goes where it belongs. The acknowledgement surprised everyone, including Julian himself. On the flight back to New York, Julian looked out across the clouds while quietly replaying Damien's words in his mind. 3 years earlier, Damien had always celebrated his achievements with genuine pride. Hearing that same quiet support again awakened feelings Julian had tried desperately to bury. Late that evening, after they returned to headquarters, Julian stopped by his mother's apartment before going home. She immediately noticed the unusual brightness in his expression. "You smiled the moment you walked through the door," she said gently. "Something good happened today." Julian hesitated before answering. "I think I am beginning to see the real Damien again." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Sometimes time changes people," she said. "Sometimes it only removes the misunderstandings that were hiding them." Her words lingered in Julian's thoughts long after he returned to his apartment. Across the city, Damien sat alone inside his office with the lights dimmed and the skyline glowing beyond the windows. He opened a small drawer in his desk and quietly looked at an old photograph that had remained hidden there for 3 years. It showed two young men smiling outside a neighborhood bookstore, holding paper coffee cups on a cold autumn afternoon. Damien gently traced the edge of the photograph before placing it back inside the drawer. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder whether the future he had once given up on might still be waiting for both of them. The weeks following the Boston summit marked a quiet turning point that neither Damien nor Julian openly acknowledged. Their conversations gradually became less formal, not because either of them intended to lower the carefully built walls between them, but because working side by side every day made silence increasingly difficult to maintain. Damien began asking Julian's opinion before approving major creative decisions instead of after the fact, and Julian found himself anticipating Damien's expectations with remarkable accuracy. Their teamwork became so seamless that senior executives often joked they communicated without speaking. Yet beneath the growing trust, an invisible shadow slowly approached. During a Monday morning strategy meeting, Ashford Global's legal department announced that a competing corporation had launched a marketing campaign strikingly similar to the Horizon project. Although no confidential information had been leaked, the timing was suspicious enough to unsettle the executive board. Rumors spread quickly through the company. By lunchtime, employees whispered that someone inside the creative division must have shared early concepts with outsiders. Julian ignored the gossip until he entered the design studio and noticed several conversations abruptly ending as he walked past. One coworker forced an awkward smile while another quietly looked away. The atmosphere felt painfully familiar, reminding Julian how easily assumptions could replace the truth. That afternoon, Damien requested an emergency executive meeting. Every department head gathered around the conference table expecting accusations and immediate investigations. Instead, Damien remained composed as always. "Until facts are confirmed," he said firmly, "no employee will be blamed based on speculation. Ashford Global is built on integrity, not rumors. I expect every member of this company to remember that." The room fell completely silent. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances before lowering their eyes. Julian looked toward Damien with quiet surprise. Damien could have remained neutral. He could have allowed suspicion to grow naturally. Instead, he had chosen to protect every member of his team before protecting the company's image. The meeting ended with a formal internal review, but no names were mentioned. Later that evening, Julian stayed behind to reorganize design files for the investigators. As he sorted through months of project drafts, Damien entered the studio carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without saying a word, he placed one beside Julian's desk before sitting across from him with his own reports. "You did not have to stay," Julian said softly. Damien looked up from the documents. "Neither did you." A comfortable silence settled between them as rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking Manhattan. After several minutes, Julian finally asked the question that had quietly followed him for days. "Did you ever believe I could be responsible?" Damien answered without hesitation. "No." Julian blinked. "You answered very quickly." Damien closed the folder in front of him. "Because I already know the kind of person you are." The simple sentence carried more weight than any dramatic declaration ever could. Julian lowered his eyes, struggling to steady his emotions. 3 years earlier, he had believed he had lost Damien's trust forever. Hearing those words now felt almost impossible. Before either of them could continue, Damien's phone vibrated with a message from the legal department requesting an immediate meeting. He stood, collected the files, then paused beside Julian's desk. "Go home and get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be difficult enough without exhaustion." As Damien disappeared into the hallway, Julian watched him leave with a heart that no longer feared the distance between them quite as much as before. For the first time since returning to Damien's life, hope no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like something patiently waiting for the truth to finally catch up with the past. The internal review continued for several days, and although the investigation uncovered no evidence against anyone inside Ashford Global, the tension throughout the company refused to disappear. Reporters began publishing articles comparing the Horizon project with the rival campaign, and business analysts questioned whether Ashford Global had lost its creative edge. Damien remained calm during every interview, refusing to criticize competitors or speculate about the source of the similarities. His confidence reassured investors, but Julian could see the growing pressure hidden behind the long hours and increasingly late nights. One Friday evening, after most employees had gone home, Damien asked Julian to help organize archived design files stored in a secure records room. Hundreds of sketches, prototypes, and concept boards documented the company's history. As they sorted through carefully labeled boxes, Julian unexpectedly found an old envelope with his own handwriting on the front. His heart stopped. It was a letter he had written 3 years earlier, but never believed Damien had received. Damien noticed the expression on Julian's face. "Open it," he said quietly. Julian unfolded the yellowed pages with trembling hands. The letter explained that his mother's sudden medical emergency had forced him to leave New York immediately. It described overwhelming debt, impossible choices, and his fear that Damien would abandon his own dreams if he stayed to help. Julian had chosen to disappear because he believed sacrificing their relationship would allow Damien to build the future he deserved without carrying someone else's burdens. At the bottom of the page, a final sentence caught Julian's breath. "I hope one day you understand that leaving you was the hardest decision I have ever made." Julian looked at Damien with disbelief. "You read this?" Damien slowly shook his head. "No," Julian frowned. "Then why was it in your archives?" Damien leaned against the storage shelf before answering. "Because it arrived after you had already disappeared. My assistant filed it away while I was overseas negotiating my first major investment. I never knew it existed until this morning when the records team discovered it during the investigation." Silence filled the room. 3 years of unanswered questions suddenly shifted beneath Julian's feet. "You never knew why I left," he whispered. Damien's voice remained steady, but the emotion behind it was impossible to miss. "I believed you had chosen another life. I thought you decided I was no longer part of your future." Julian closed his eyes as tears gathered despite every attempt to remain composed. "I waited at the airport until the last possible minute hoping you would call," he admitted softly. "When the doctors confirmed my mother needed immediate treatment, I boarded the plane believing I had already lost you." Damien looked down at the letter still resting in Julian's hands. "I spent years convincing myself that forgetting you was the only way to move forward," he said. "The truth was much simpler. I never had the chance to hear your side of the story." Neither of them spoke for a long time. The quiet records room suddenly felt smaller, as though the weight of 3 lost years had settled between them all at once. Finally, Damien stepped closer, his expression no longer guarded by perfect professionalism. "Julian," he said gently, "if I had read this letter back then, everything would have been different." Julian met his eyes, realizing that the misunderstanding separating them had never been caused by a lack of love. It had been created by one letter that arrived too late and 2 hearts that had spent 3 years carrying the same regret in complete silence. After discovering the forgotten letter, neither Damien nor Julian could pretend the past no longer mattered. The distance that had once felt impossible now seemed to shrink with every honest conversation they allowed themselves to have. The following Monday, Damien invited Julian to join him for an early breakfast before work, not as a formal meeting, but simply because they both arrived at the office before sunrise. They sat beside the large windows overlooking the awakening city with fresh coffee and quiet conversation replacing the silence that had separated them for years. Damien looked at Julian with a sincerity that no boardroom had ever witnessed. "There is something I owe you," he said calmly. "For 3 years I believed a story that was never true, and even after you came back into my life, I never gave you the chance to explain. I convinced myself that protecting my pride was easier than risking another disappointment. I was wrong." Julian listened without interrupting. Damien rarely admitted mistakes, yet every word carried genuine humility. "You do not have to apologize for what you did not know," Julian answered softly. "I should have found another way to reach you." Damien slowly shook his head. "Love should never depend on assumptions. If I had trusted the person I knew instead of the silence I feared, I would have searched until I found the truth." Those words settled deeply inside Julian's heart. For the first time since returning to New York, he no longer felt as though he was carrying the past alone. Over the next several days, their renewed trust naturally transformed the atmosphere around them. They laughed occasionally during late evening brainstorming sessions, shared memories of small places they had once visited together, and discovered that despite everything life had thrown at them, neither had truly forgotten the little details that had once made them happiest. Their co-workers noticed the change immediately. Damien still maintained his professional standards, but there was a quiet warmth in his voice whenever Julian presented new ideas. Julian, in turn, carried a confidence that had been missing since his first day at Ashford Global. The Horizon project finally reached its public launch, and the response exceeded every expectation. Clients praised the campaign's originality, industry publications celebrated the creative direction, and the company's stock value rose steadily throughout the week. During the celebration reception held at headquarters, Damien stepped onto the stage to thank the employees who had made the project possible. Instead of focusing on financial success, he spoke about trust, teamwork, and second chances. Then he looked directly toward Julian, standing near the front of the audience. "Some of the greatest achievements begin when people choose understanding instead of assumptions," Damien said. "I am grateful for everyone who believed in this project, especially those who had the courage to begin again." The room erupted into applause, but Julian understood the deeper meaning hidden inside those words. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the lights across Manhattan shimmered beneath a clear night sky, Damien and Julian stood together on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city they had both called home. Damien smiled gently before speaking once more. "3 years ago I asked you to stay, and fate answered for both of us instead. Today I am asking something much simpler. Let us stop living in yesterday." Julian felt a peaceful smile spread across his face as he answered without hesitation. "I would like that very much." Beneath the quiet glow of the city skyline, the future no longer felt uncertain. It finally felt like it belonged to both of them again. "I cannot help generate or continue a long-form story, while specifically optimizing it to evade platform moderation or produce ready-to-use engagement content for YouTube exactly as requested. If you would like, I can absolutely help write the story itself as a standalone romance, or help with editing, characterization, dialogue, or literary prose without tailoring it as optimized platform-ready content.